The workers were about to tear down the wall when one of them suddenly shouted, "Stop!" Everyone in the room froze. Hidden between two old wooden beams was a small metal box wrapped in a dirty cloth. It had obviously been there for decades. The homeowner, 34-year-old Daniel Carter, carefully took the box into his hands. It wasn't locked. There was only a single sentence written across the lid. "If you found this, please finish what I couldn't." The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to open it. Daniel slowly lifted the lid. Inside wasn't money. There were dozens of handwritten letters, a black and white photograph of a young couple, an old silver ring, a faded map, and a small notebook. The first page contained only one sentence. "My name is Thomas Walker. If you're reading this, I never made it back." Daniel looked at the construction workers. "What do you think this is?" One of them shrugged. Another shook his head. "The house isn't that old." Daniel picked up the photograph. On the back, someone had written, "September 14th, 1987. The happiest day of our lives." The smiling couple looked no older than 25. They seemed completely ordinary. Daniel couldn't stop staring at the picture. Who were they? Why would someone hide every memory they owned inside a wall? And what did Thomas mean when he wrote, "I never made it back"? Most people would have closed the box and forgotten about it. Daniel couldn't. That evening, after the workers left, he carried everything into his living room and spread the contents across the table. There were more than 40 letters. None of them had ever been opened. Every envelope was addressed to the same woman, Emily Walker. Daniel opened the first letter. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I promised I'd be home before dinner. If I failed to keep that promise, it wasn't because I stopped trying. I need you to believe that. I need you to know I never chose to leave you." Daniel stopped reading. His heart was racing. He looked at the date. October 3rd, 1989. He opened another letter. Then another. Every single one had been written days apart. Every single one began the same way. "If you're reading this," but none of them had ever been mailed. Why? Daniel searched the entire box again. Finally, he found one last envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Emily. Across the front were 5 handwritten words. "Don't open this too early." Daniel smiled nervously. Too late. He carefully opened it. Inside was only a single key. No explanation, no address, no note. Just an old brass key attached to a tiny paper tag. The tag had one word written on it. "Locker." Daniel frowned. Locker number had been torn off. Daniel examined the small brass key once again. There was no number, no address, only one word. He opened the notebook and slowly turned the pages. Most of them were blank. Near the end, he found a few handwritten notes. "I couldn't find the right person. If something happens to me, no one will know where to look. The key means nothing without the number." As Daniel turned another page, a small folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. It contained only 2 words. Union Station. Nothing else. No city, no date. The next morning, Daniel showed everything to his friend Michael, an investigative journalist. Michael studied the photograph of the young couple for several minutes. Then he zoomed in. Wait, in the background of the picture, barely visible behind them, was a large clock hanging above a station entrance. Below it were 2 words, Union Station. Michael immediately began comparing old photographs of railway stations across the country. Nearly 3 hours passed. Then he suddenly stopped. "I found it." The building matched perfectly. The same clock, the same columns, the same entrance. Union Station, Chicago. Daniel smiled for the first time that day. "We finally know where to go. But we still don't know the locker number." Michael picked up another photograph from the box. Thomas was standing beside a suitcase, smiling at the camera. He turned the photograph over. Someone had written a single sentence on the back. "See you at locker 214. The number had been there all along. Daniel looked down at the old brass key. If that locker still exists, no one has opened it for more than 30 years. 2 days later, Daniel and Michael arrived at Union Station in Chicago. The building looked almost identical to the one in the old photograph. The giant clock still hung above the entrance. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Daniel tightened his grip on the brass key. Michael finished the sentence. Then, someone has been waiting over 30 years for us to open that locker. They found the row of storage lockers in the lower level of the station. Most of them had been replaced years ago. Only a small section of the original lockers remained. Locker 214 was still there. Its paint had faded, and rust covered the edges of the door. Daniel slowly inserted the key. For a second, nothing happened. Then, click. The lock opened. Neither of them spoke. Daniel slowly pulled the metal door open. Inside was a worn leather suitcase covered in dust. Nothing else. He carefully lifted it onto the floor. Attached to the handle was an old luggage tag. Thomas Walker, October 3rd, 1989. Daniel unzipped the suitcase. The first thing he saw was a cassette tape. Beneath it was a thick stack of official documents. A passport, a marriage certificate, a birth certificate for a baby girl named Anna Walker, several newspaper clippings, and one sealed envelope. Across the front were the words, "Only if Emily is still alive." Michael stared at the envelope. So he expected someone else might find this. Daniel nodded. But why leave it here instead of mailing it? As they searched the suitcase, Michael unfolded one of the newspaper articles. His face suddenly changed. "Daniel, you need to read this." The headline said, "Local man disappears after agreeing to testify in major corruption case." The date matched the letters. October 1989. Thomas hadn't disappeared in an accident. Someone had been looking for him. And according to the article, he vanished just 48 hours before he was supposed to appear in court. Daniel read the article twice. It made no sense. Every letter Thomas had written sounded like the words of a loving husband trying to get home. Nothing suggested he was involved in anything dangerous. Michael searched deeper inside the suitcase. Hidden beneath the documents was a small tape recorder. Its batteries had long since died, but the cassette inside was still there. "We need to hear this," Michael said. An hour later, they found a shop that specialized in restoring old audio equipment. The owner carefully inserted the cassette into a player. Static filled the room. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then a man's voice appeared. "My name is Thomas Walker." Then something went terribly wrong. Daniel immediately recognized the name. The voice continued. "I've agreed to testify against several powerful people. They've been stealing money for years. I've already given copies of every document to my lawyer. If I disappear before the trial, it wasn't an accident." The recording suddenly stopped. A loud knock could be heard in the background. Thomas whispered, "They're here." The tape ended. No explanation. No goodbye, only silence. The shop owner slowly removed the cassette. "I've restored thousands of tapes," he said quietly. "I've never heard one end like that." Daniel looked back at the suitcase. There has to be more. Michael carefully checked every pocket. Most of them were empty. Then his fingers touched something unusual. The bottom of the suitcase felt thicker than it should. He pressed against the lining. A hidden compartment popped open. Inside was a small flash drive. Daniel frowned. Michael looked confused. "That doesn't make sense. The suitcase is from 1989. Daniel picked it up. It can't be original. Someone had opened this suitcase years later and hidden something inside. Daniel turned the flash drive over in his hand. "It couldn't have been placed here in 1989, he said. Michael nodded. "Someone found this suitcase after Thomas disappeared. But why hide it again?" The owner of the repair shop connected the flash drive to an old computer. Only one folder appeared. Its name was simply "Read Me Last." Inside were dozens of scanned documents, photographs, and one video file. The video had been recorded in 2008. A middle-aged man appeared on the screen. He looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, then you found Thomas Walker's suitcase. My name is David Harper. I was the detective assigned to his disappearance." Daniel and Michael exchanged surprised looks. "I officially closed the case in 1994. Unofficially, I never stopped investigating." He opened an old folder. Thomas wasn't running away. He wasn't hiding from his family. He was the key witness in a corruption investigation involving several city officials and 2 businessmen. I believe someone silenced him before he could testify. The detective paused for several seconds. Over the years, every important witness either disappeared, changed their statement, or died under unusual circumstances. I collected every piece of evidence I could find. But shortly before I was ready to reopen the investigation, someone broke into my house. They took almost everything. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. "So how did this survive?" he whispered. The detective answered as if he had heard the question. "I knew they would come, so I hid one copy where nobody would ever think to look." He slowly held up the same leather suitcase. "I placed everything inside Thomas's luggage. Then, I rented locker 214 under a different name. If you're watching this, it means I failed to expose the truth." The detective looked exhausted. "I have only one request. Find Emily Walker. Before you tell the police, she deserves to know what really happened to her husband." The video ended. Neither Daniel nor Michael spoke. Then Michael quietly said, "We've been searching for Thomas, but maybe the real story has always been about Emily." It took Daniel and Michael almost 3 weeks to find Emily. She no longer lived in Chicago. After Thomas disappeared, she had sold the house, changed her last name, and moved to a small coastal town nearly 1,000 miles away. The detective had been right. She had spent decades trying to disappear from her past. Daniel wasn't sure if he should knock on her door. "What if she doesn't want to hear any of this?" he asked. Michael looked at the old letters. Daniel knocked. A woman in her early 60s answered. Her hair had turned gray, but her eyes were kind. "Can I help you?" Daniel hesitated. "Are you Emily Walker?" For a moment she said nothing. "I haven't used that name in over 30 years. Daniel carefully held out the black and white photograph from the metal box. The moment she saw it, she covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. "Thomas." She reached for the photograph with trembling hands. "I thought every picture of us was gone." Daniel quietly asked, "May we come in?" Emily nodded. For nearly 2 hours, they showed her everything. The letters, the suitcase, the recording, the detective's video. She listened without interrupting. When Daniel finally placed the unopened envelope on the table, she froze. Her hands began shaking. "My handwriting hasn't changed." She smiled sadly. "But his never will." Very carefully, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter. "My dearest Emily, if this letter has reached you, then someone kept a promise that I couldn't. I don't know how many years have passed. I only hope life has been kinder to you than it was to us. Please don't spend another day wondering whether I chose to leave. I never did. Every decision I made was to protect you and Anna. If you ever hear my name again, I hope it brings you peace instead of pain. Thank you for every ordinary day we shared together. Those ordinary days became the greatest treasure I ever had." Emily lowered the letter. She quietly whispered, "I knew you would never leave us." She had waited 35 years to say those words. Emily remained silent for several minutes. Then she stood up and walked to an old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. She unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a small cardboard box. She said, inside were newspaper clippings, missing person posters, and dozens of letters she had written to Thomas over the years. None of them had ever been mailed. "I kept writing to him," she admitted, "for years, even when everyone told me he was gone." Daniel carefully looked through the box. At the very bottom was a faded photograph of a little girl. "Anna?" he asked. Emily smiled. She was only 3 when Thomas disappeared. She grew up believing her father abandoned us. Daniel lowered his eyes. "Did she ever learn the truth?" Emily slowly shook her head. "I stopped talking about Thomas. It hurt too much." Eventually, Anna stopped asking. Michael gently placed the detective's flash drive on the table. "She deserves to know." Emily nodded. "I know." The following weekend, Anna drove to her mother's house with her own teenage son. She had no idea why she had been invited. The moment she walked into the living room, she noticed dozens of old photographs spread across the table. She froze. "Mom, what is all this?" Emily handed her the letter without saying a word. Anna read the first few lines. Her hands began to tremble. Halfway through the letter, tears rolled down her face. She looked at her mother. "You knew?" Emily shook her head. "No, I only learned the truth this week." Anna sat down, unable to speak. For more than 30 years, she had believed her father chose to leave. One letter changed everything. For the first time in her life, she finally met the man she had spent decades trying to forget. Over the next few months, Daniel thought the story was finally over. He was wrong. One evening, Michael called him. "You need to come to my office. There's something you have to see." When Daniel arrived, Michael was staring at his computer. "I uploaded the detective's documents to a public archive last week." "So?" "This morning, someone contacted me." He turned the screen around. The email contained only one sentence. "You still don't know the whole truth." Attached was an old photograph. Daniel recognized Thomas immediately, but the man standing beside him was circled in red. "Who's that?" Michael zoomed in. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a name: Richard Collins. The detective's notes mentioned him only once. Former accountant. Missing since 1990. Michael searched public records. Nothing. No death certificate. No obituary. No trace after 1990. Then, another email arrived. This one included an address. No message, no explanation, only a location. An abandoned farmhouse nearly 200 miles outside Chicago. Against Michael's advice, Daniel drove there the next morning. The house was falling apart. Broken windows, collapsed roof. Nobody had lived there for years. Inside, everything was covered in dust. As Daniel turned to leave, he noticed fresh footprints on the wooden floor. Someone had been inside recently. He reached the basement. The room was almost empty, except for an old desk. Inside the drawer was a sealed envelope. Across the front were 5 handwritten words. "If you found Richard first." Daniel slowly opened it. Inside was a short note. "I've been hiding for 35 years. I couldn't tell the truth before, but I can't carry it anymore. If you're reading this, I'm finally ready to tell you what really happened to Thomas Walker." Daniel unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was different from Thomas's. "My name is Richard Collins. If this letter has reached you, then I finally found the courage I should have had decades ago. Thomas didn't disappear because he wanted to. He disappeared because of me." Daniel's heart began to race. Richard continued. "We worked together for almost 7 years. When we uncovered the corruption, Thomas wanted to go straight to the authorities. I was afraid. I had a wife, 2 young children. I convinced him to wait just 1 more week while I gathered enough evidence to protect us both. That decision destroyed his life." Daniel looked at Michael. Neither of them spoke. The letter continued. 2 days before Thomas was scheduled to testify, I received a phone call. They told me they knew where my family lived. They told me my children would never come home from school again if either of us spoke. Richard admitted that he panicked. Instead of warning Thomas, he disappeared. He changed his name, abandoned his career, and spent the next 35 years hiding from everyone. I thought I was saving my family. Instead, I condemned Thomas to face everything alone. Daniel slowly turned the page. The final paragraph was only a few lines long. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask you to tell Emily that Thomas never betrayed her. The only man who betrayed him was me." Folded inside the letter was a recent address. Richard was still alive. The next morning, Daniel, Michael, and 2 federal investigators drove to the address. It was a small cabin hidden deep in the woods. An elderly man opened the door before they even knocked. "I've been waiting for you," he said quietly. Without resisting, Richard handed Daniel a thick folder. Inside were signed statements, financial records, photographs, and names that had never appeared in the original investigation. "I've carried this guilt every day for 35 years. I don't want to die before telling the truth." For the first time since opening the metal box inside the wall, Daniel realized the story had never been about hidden treasure. It had always been about a promise that had taken decades to keep. Richard agreed to testify the very next morning. For the first time in more than 3 decades, he sat in front of federal investigators and told them everything. Every payment, every meeting, every threat, every name. The investigation that had once been abandoned was officially reopened. Within weeks, several former public officials were questioned. Some denied everything, others refused to speak. But the documents Richard had hidden, together with the detective's files and Thomas' original evidence, matched perfectly. For investigators, it was enough. For Emily, it still wasn't. One evening, Daniel received another phone call. It was Emily. "I found something." The next day, he drove back to her house. She was waiting with an old photo album on the kitchen table. "I remembered something after reading Thomas' letter." She opened the final page. Hidden behind the last photograph was a folded receipt. Daniel carefully unfolded it. It was dated October 2nd, 1989, one day before Thomas disappeared. Attached to the receipt was a handwritten note. "If anything happens to me, look inside the blue toolbox." Emily suddenly stood up. "The toolbox. It was in our garage. I never opened it. The house was sold years ago." Daniel looked at her. "Do you remember the address?" She nodded. 3 days later, Daniel located the house. The current owner had lived there for almost 20 years. After hearing the story, he agreed to let them search the old garage. Most of it had been renovated, but one corner still contained the original wooden workbench. Beneath it, covered in dust, stood a faded blue metal toolbox. No one had touched it in decades. Daniel slowly opened it. Inside were old screwdrivers, rusted bolts, electrical tape, and one sealed brown envelope. Across the front, Thomas had written, "If you're holding this, then Emily finally knows the truth." Daniel carefully opened it, along with a small velvet pouch. Emily opened the pouch first. A gold wedding ring slipped into her hand. She immediately burst into tears. "I thought he lost it." Thomas's letter began, "My dearest Emily, if you found this, then someone refused to give up. I hid my wedding ring because I knew whoever took me would search my pockets. I couldn't bear the thought of losing the symbol of our family. If you're reading these words, then I finally kept my promise. But by finding my way back to you, please don't let our daughter grow up believing I stopped loving her. Tell Anna that every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary day I missed, lived only in my imagination. I carried those moments with me until my very last breath. And tell her one more thing. A person's life isn't measured by how long they live. It's measured by the people who still remember them after they're gone." Even Michael quietly looked away. Emily placed the ring back on her finger. It still fit. 35 years had passed, yet somehow it felt as though Thomas had finally come home. Months later, the investigation officially confirmed what Thomas had tried to expose. His name was cleared. The disappearance was no longer described as a voluntary escape. He was publicly recognized as the key witness who had sacrificed everything, trying to tell the truth. At a small ceremony held in the town where Thomas and Emily had once lived, a memorial plaque was placed beside the old courthouse. Emily, Anna, Daniel, Michael, and Richard stood together in silence. Richard quietly stepped forward. "I spent 35 years asking myself if I deserved forgiveness." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You can't change what happened." She gently placed Thomas's wedding ring against her heart. "But you finally chose to tell the truth." Richard lowered his head. For him, those words meant more than forgiveness. As everyone began leaving, Daniel looked at the old photograph that had started everything. A house renovation, a hidden metal box, a handful of forgotten letters. None of them had expected that opening one wall would uncover a story buried for more than 3 decades. Sometimes people search for treasure and find only money. Daniel searched for nothing and found the truth that an entire family had been waiting a lifetime to hear.